You're pathetic, Cordelia. Absolutely worthless. Why don't you leave before you embarrass yourself any further? Those were the words Clyde Ashford, the billionaire husband, said after his mistress Melody poured wine on his wife's dress in front of 300 people. 300 witnesses to her complete humiliation. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others smirked, entertained by the drama. Cordelia just stood there, wine dripping from her dress, and something inside her shifted. Not breaking down, breaking open. If you want to see how a humiliated wife served justice and reclaimed everything he stole, subscribe now, because this story is just getting started. Here's the question. Have you ever had a moment where you finally saw someone's true nature clearly for the first time? Drop a comment and let me know, because Cordelia's awakening was about to change everything. But to understand how Cordelia reached that breaking point in the parking garage, you need to know who she was before Clyde Ashford destroyed her piece by piece. 6 years earlier, Cordelia wasn't the ghost of a woman standing alone at charity galas. She was Richard Evermore's daughter, the heir to Evermore Industries, a mid-sized but deeply respected construction and development firm that her father had built from the ground up. Richard Evermore wasn't interested in building empires. He built hospitals, affordable housing, infrastructure projects that actually mattered to communities. He believed that business should serve people, not the other way around. And Cordelia had grown up watching him turn that philosophy into something real and tangible. She'd spent her childhood on construction sites, wearing a hard hat that was too big for her head, asking questions about blueprints and load-bearing walls. Richard always answered her seriously, like her questions mattered, like she mattered. By the time Cordelia turned 25, she understood the business better than most people twice her age. She knew the clients, she knew the projects, she knew her father's vision for what Evermore Industries could become. And then Richard died. A heart attack. Sudden. No warning. One day he was reviewing plans for a new community center, and the next day Cordelia was planning his funeral. She was 25 years old, grieving, and completely unprepared to run a company. The board of directors looked at her with sympathy and doubt. Clients called to offer condolences that sounded a lot like concerns about the future. Employees whispered about whether the company would survive the transition. Cordelia felt like she was drowning in responsibility she didn't know how to handle. And that's when Clyde Ashford appeared. He was 38, already successful in commercial real estate development, the kind of man who walked into a room and immediately became its center. Charismatic in that specific way that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world when he's talking to you. He'd known Richard professionally. Not well, but enough to attend the funeral, to offer his condolences with what seemed like genuine emotion. And then he offered to help, just temporarily, he said, just until Cordelia found her footing. He understood the business. He had connections. He could handle the operational side while she grieved and figured out what she wanted to do next. It seemed like a lifeline when she was drowning. Clyde was patient in those early months, attentive in ways that felt like he actually cared. He'd call to check on her, not just about business but about how she was doing, if she'd eaten, if she'd slept. He told her he understood grief because he'd lost his own parents young. That he knew what it felt like to carry responsibility you weren't ready for. That he'd help her carry it until she was strong enough to do it alone. Cordelia fell in love with the man who seemed to understand her pain. They married within a year of her father's death. Looking back, she'd realize how fast that was, how vulnerable she'd been, how perfectly Clyde had positioned himself. But in the moment, it felt like finding solid ground after months of free fall. At first, the marriage felt like a real partnership. Clyde handled the business operations while Cordelia focused on maintaining her father's philanthropic vision. They'd have dinner together and talk about upcoming projects. He'd ask her opinion on contracts. He'd include her in meetings with major clients. And Clyde was good at what he did. That was the thing Cordelia couldn't deny. He expanded contracts that Richard had started. He secured new investors. He grew Evermore Industries beyond what her father had built, taking on bigger projects, more ambitious developments. The company was thriving under Clyde's leadership. But somewhere along the way, so gradually that Cordelia didn't notice it happening. Everything changed. She stopped being consulted about decisions. She'd hear about new contracts after they were already signed. She'd walk into the office and learn about meetings she hadn't been invited to about her own father's company. When she asked questions, Clyde called it paranoia. He'd sigh like she was being difficult and explain that he was handling everything so she didn't have to worry. Wasn't that what she wanted? To not be overwhelmed? When she pushed back, when she insisted on being more involved, he called it inexperience. He'd remind her gently that she didn't have his years of business development expertise, that she was still learning, that maybe she should trust him to know what was best. And when she really insisted, when she demanded to be included in decisions about her inheritance, Clyde's patience would wear thin. He'd remind her how much he'd sacrificed to save her father's legacy from collapse, how the company had been struggling before he stepped in, how without his expertise and connections, Evermore Industries would have been dissolved or sold off piece by piece. He'd ask if that's what she wanted. To destroy everything Richard had built, because she couldn't handle not being in control of every little detail. The gaslighting was so gradual, so expertly done, that Cordelia didn't realize she was being erased until she'd already disappeared. She signed documents she'd barely read because Clyde assured her they were routine. She agreed to operational changes because he explained them in ways that made her feel stupid for not understanding. She stepped back from the company because he convinced her it was what was best for everyone. And then, 3 years into the marriage, Melody appeared. Clyde introduced her as his new assistant. Young, beautiful, ambitious. He brought her to company events, let her sit in on executive meetings, included her in business dinners that Cordelia wasn't invited to anymore. When Cordelia confronted him about it, Clyde looked at her like she was being ridiculous. Everyone had assistants. Everyone networked. Was she really going to be that kind of wife? Jealous and insecure? That was beneath her. But Cordelia wasn't stupid. She saw things. Assistants didn't wear Cartier bracelets that cost more than their annual salary. They didn't take weekend trips to Aspen with their bosses. They didn't look at married men's wives with barely concealed contempt. Melody wasn't just Clyde's assistant. She was his mistress, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. The humiliation became routine, expected, part of Cordelia's daily existence. Clyde would forget her at restaurants, walking out with colleagues while she was still in the bathroom. He'd schedule business dinners on their anniversary and act surprised when she mentioned the date. He'd leave her out of family photos at company events, standing with Melody instead. And Melody was always there, always perfectly styled, always reminding Cordelia of everything she wasn't. Younger, more exciting, more relevant to Clyde's world. Cordelia became the wife people pitied, the woman everyone knew was being cheated on but no one talked about directly. She could see it in their eyes at parties, that mixture of sympathy and judgment. Poor Cordelia. Why doesn't she just leave? She tried once. 2 years into the marriage, when things had gotten so bad she couldn't pretend anymore. She told Clyde she wanted a divorce. He didn't get angry, he got strategic. He reminded her very calmly that Evermore Industries was now technically under his operational control. That she'd signed agreements during those early grief-stricken months that gave him authority to run the company. That if she walked away, if she tried to take back control, the transition would be so messy and expensive that the company would likely be dissolved. Her father's legacy. Everything Richard had built. All those hospitals and housing projects and community centers, gone. Because Cordelia couldn't handle her jealousy and insecurity. Did she really want to betray her father's memory over this? So Cordelia stayed. She stayed and swallowed her pride. She stayed and apologized for taking up space. She stayed and watched Melody take over more and more of her life while Clyde treated her like an inconvenient piece of furniture. The woman who'd once had fire, who'd walked construction sites with her father and asked questions about load-bearing walls, became someone who apologized for existing. That's who Cordelia was when she walked out of the gala with wine dripping down her dress. But something had finally broken open inside her that night. She sat in her car in the parking garage, hands shaking on the steering wheel, wine-stained dress clinging to her skin. She didn't start the engine. She just sat there, replaying every moment on an endless loop. Melody's smile that didn't reach her eyes, the wine cascading down her dress, the terrible silence of 300 people watching, Clyde's voice calling her pathetic, worthless, embarrassing. Her phone buzzed, a text from Clyde, not asking if she was okay, not apologizing, just 5 words that told her everything she needed to know about her marriage. "Stop being dramatic, you're embarrassing both of us." Not concern. Just irritation that she was making him look bad. Something inside Cordelia cracked, but not the way it had before. This wasn't breaking down. This was breaking open. She started the car and drove home, the house that hadn't felt like hers in years. The house that Clyde had redecorated to impress clients, erasing every trace of Richard's memory except for one room. She walked inside, still wearing the ruined dress. The house was empty. Clyde wouldn't be home tonight. He never was after these events. She knew where he'd be, knew who he'd be with. And for the first time in years, she didn't care. Cordelia went straight to the bar and poured herself scotch from the crystal decanter Clyde had bought to impress investors. Expensive scotch she'd never been offered. She took the glass and walked to her father's study. It was the one room in the house Clyde never entered. Too sentimental, too outdated, too Richard. The walls were lined with photos. Cordelia and her father at construction sites, ribbon-cutting ceremonies for community centers, events where Richard was honored for his contributions to affordable housing. Her father always looked proud in these photos, not proud of himself, but proud of what they'd built together. Richard believed business should serve people, not the other way around. Cordelia wondered what he'd think of what his company had become under Clyde's leadership. Bigger? Yes. More profitable? Definitely. But serving who? Building what? She sat at her father's old desk, still wearing the wine-stained dress, and opened the drawer. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just touching things that had been Richard's, grounding herself in the memory of the man who believed she mattered. That's when she found it. A business card, edges worn, tucked into an old leather notebook she'd forgotten about. Nathan Cross, attorney at law. The memory came back sharp and clear. Nathan had been her father's lawyer and friend. He'd handled Richard's estate, walked Cordelia through probate during those horrible months after the funeral. He'd offered support that felt genuine, not performative, and he'd advised caution about Clyde's involvement in the company. Cordelia remembered sitting in Nathan's office, paperwork spread across his desk, and Nathan asking careful questions about Clyde's role, about the operational agreements she was signing, about whether she was sure she wanted to move this fast. But Cordelia had been too grief-stricken and too in love to listen. She'd signed everything, trusted everything, given Clyde exactly what he needed to take control. She hadn't spoken to Nathan in 5 years. Hadn't thought about him because Clyde had gradually isolated her from everyone who'd been part of her father's world. But now, sitting in Richard's study at 2 a.m, wine-stained and broken open, Cordelia looked at that business card and made a decision. For the first time in years, a decision that was entirely her own. She opened her laptop and sent an email. Short, direct, desperate. "Nathan, I need help. Can we meet?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Before the voice in her head that sounded like Clyde could tell her she was being dramatic, being paranoid, being difficult. And then Cordelia sat in her father's study, still wearing the ruined dress, and waited for dawn. 3 days later, Cordelia met Nathan Cross at a small cafe across town. Far from anywhere Clyde's social circle would frequent, far from anyone who might recognize her and report back. Nathan looked exactly as she remembered. Sharp eyes, measured movements, the kind of man who listened more than he talked. When he saw her walk in, something flickered across his face. Not pity, exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd suspected all along. They sat at a corner table. Nathan ordered coffee. Cordelia ordered tea she wouldn't drink. And then, for the first time in 6 years, Cordelia told someone the truth. She told him about the isolation. About being gradually erased from her own father's company. About Melody. About the humiliation that had become so routine she'd almost stopped noticing it. She told him about the gala, the wine. Clyde calling her pathetic in front of 300 people. But mostly she told him about the gut feeling that something about the business wasn't right. That there were meetings she wasn't told about, contracts she'd never seen, decisions being made using her name that she had no knowledge of. Nathan didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just listened with that careful attention that made Cordelia feel like maybe she wasn't crazy after all. When she finished, he asked one question. "Do you want out? Or do you want answers?" Cordelia realized in that moment that she wanted both. Nathan explained something Cordelia had forgotten in all the years of being told she was inexperienced and uninformed. As Richard's heir, she technically still owned majority shares in Evermore Industries. But operational control had been transferred to Clyde through marriage and a series of legal agreements she'd signed during those early grief-stricken months. She barely remembered signing them. Just Clyde putting papers in front of her, explaining they were routine, necessary, temporary. Nathan suggested they start by reviewing those documents, all of them, along with any major contracts Clyde had signed on behalf of the company. It took 3 weeks to get the paperwork. Clyde's assistant helped, not Melody, one of the actual employees who'd worked for Richard and remembered when Cordelia used to walk the halls like she belonged there. She was sympathetic. Quietly, carefully, she provided access to the digital archives, files that Cordelia should have had access to all along but had somehow been locked out of. Nathan reviewed everything with a forensic accountant he trusted, and what they found was so much worse than Cordelia had imagined. Dozens of contracts. Expansion deals with major developers, investor agreements worth millions, all bearing Cordelia's signature as majority shareholder, all requiring her legal authorization. The problem was simple and devastating. Cordelia had never signed them. Her signature was there, perfect, legally binding, on document after document after document. But she had no memory of these contracts, no email trails asking for her approval, no meeting notes, no correspondence, nothing. She'd never seen these documents before. Nathan put them in front of her. Nathan arranged for a handwriting analysis. Professional. Thorough. The kind that would hold up in court. The results came back conclusive. Forgery. Sophisticated, expertly done, but forgery nonetheless. Clyde had been forging Cordelia's signature for years, using her ownership stake to authorize deals, secure investments, and expand an empire built entirely on fraud. Every major move he'd made. Every triumph he'd celebrated at company dinners while Cordelia sat silently at the other end of the table. Every dollar he'd earned and every deal he'd closed. All of it built on stolen authority. All of it using her name without her knowledge or consent. Cordelia sat in Nathan's office, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not shock, exactly. More like confirmation of something she'd known but hadn't been able to name. She asked the only question that mattered. What do we do now? Nathan's answer was careful. Strategic. We build a case, quietly, and we wait for the right moment. And that's exactly what Cordelia did. She became two people. At home, she was the same quiet, diminished wife. She attended Clyde's events in elegant dresses and made polite conversation. She smiled at Melody, even though every smile felt like swallowing glass. She endured the casual cruelty that had become so routine she could predict it. But in the margins of her life, she became someone else entirely. Someone with purpose. Someone with a plan. Someone who was going to take back everything that had been stolen from her. She met with Nathan weekly. Always at different locations. Always careful. They built a timeline of every forged signature, every fraudulent contract, every deal that should never have been authorized. The forensic accountant traced money flows, investor communications, board meeting minutes. He found patterns that proved Clyde's deception went back to the very beginning. To those early months after Richard's death, when Cordelia had been too grief-stricken to notice what was being stolen. Clyde had been careful. But he hadn't been perfect. There were inconsistencies. Dates when Cordelia was provably somewhere else when documents were supposedly signed. Email chains where Clyde referenced her approval on deals she'd never heard of. Board meetings where her vote was recorded despite her not being present. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, enough to destroy everything Clyde had built. But Nathan warned her that timing was everything. If they exposed Clyde prematurely, he'd have time to cover his tracks, to intimidate witnesses, to restructure assets and hide money, to build a defense that might work. They needed leverage. They needed perfect timing. They needed to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. And in the meantime, Cordelia needed to hold herself together while living in the same house as the man who was systematically erasing her. It was harder than she'd expected. There were nights when Clyde came home late, smelling like Melody's perfume, and Cordelia had to pour him coffee in the morning and ask about his day like she cared. Like her heart wasn't pounding with rage. There were dinners where he talked about upcoming deals, including something massive he'd been working on for months. Some kind of international contract that would cement his legacy forever. $8.4 billion, he told her casually over pasta. The biggest deal of his career. The deal that would make Evermore Industries a global name. And she had to nod and smile and say how proud she was while mentally cataloging every detail for Nathan. While wondering if her forged signature was already on those documents too. There were moments when Melody texted Clyde at the dinner table and he'd laugh at whatever she said. And Cordelia had to sit there, swallowing rage so thick it choked her, pretending she didn't notice. But she did it, because every fake smile was strategic, every swallowed insult was calculated, every quiet evening was one day closer to the moment when she'd take everything back. Nathan asked her once, during one of their secret meetings, if she was sure she wanted to go through with this. Exposing Clyde wouldn't just embarrass him, it would destroy everything he'd built, his reputation, his business, his freedom. It would be public, messy, potentially dangerous. Was she absolutely certain this was what she wanted? Cordelia thought about wine dripping down her dress, her husband's laughter, 300 witnesses, 6 years of being called worthless. She told Nathan she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. If you're watching this and wondering how far Cordelia will go to destroy the man who destroyed her, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will shock you. And here's my question. Have you ever had to pretend everything was fine while secretly planning your escape? Drop a comment, because Cordelia's double life was about to lead to the most devastating revenge. 3 months into the investigation, everything changed. Clyde came home one evening, animated in a way Cordelia hadn't seen in years. Maybe ever. He practically burst through the door, loosened his tie like he couldn't contain his excitement, poured himself expensive whiskey, and announced it like he was declaring victory in a war. He'd closed it. The big one. The deal that would make everything else look like practice runs. An $8.4 billion infrastructure contract with an international consortium. Government-backed, multi-year. The kind of project that gets you on the covers of business magazines and invited to speak at economic summits with world leaders. $8.4 billion. Cordelia stood in the kitchen, pretending to care about the salad she was making, while Clyde paced and talked and radiated triumph like electricity. The contract was being finalized over the next 6 weeks. There would be press releases, investor calls, media interviews, and a signing ceremony at the company's downtown headquarters, with all the pomp and circumstance befitting the biggest deal in Evermore Industries history. Clyde was electric, unstoppable, already planning what suit he'd wear, what he'd say in his speech, who he'd thank. He even acknowledged Cordelia at dinner that night. Actually looked at her across the table and spoke to her like she was a person instead of furniture. He told her that her father would be proud, that Richard's little company was about to become a global name, that this deal would cement the Evermore legacy forever. The irony was so thick, Cordelia nearly laughed out loud. Her father would be proud. A fraud, a forgery, of a man who'd stolen his daughter's inheritance and built an empire on lies. But Cordelia just smiled, nodded, said something appropriate about how exciting it all was, and the moment Clyde went upstairs to make celebratory phone calls, she pulled out her phone and texted Nathan. He's signing the big contract in 6 weeks. That's our window. Nathan called an emergency meeting for the next morning. They met at his office before dawn. Nathan, the forensic accountant, 2 other attorneys Nathan trusted completely, and Cordelia, who'd told Clyde she had an early dentist appointment. If they were going to move, Nathan explained, they needed everything buttoned up. Perfect, airtight, every piece of evidence verified and re-verified, every legal strategy mapped out in detail, every potential counterattack Clyde might make anticipated and prepared for. Because once they exposed him, there would be no going back. No second chances. They had to get it right the first time. They worked around the clock for the next 2 weeks. The forensic accountant went back through the $8.4 billion contract with a fine-tooth comb. He confirmed what they'd suspected. The deal required Cordelia's signature as majority shareholder. It was legally necessary. Without her authorization, the contract wasn't valid. And just like all the others, Cordelia had never signed it. Her signature was there on the documents. Perfect. Legally binding to anyone who didn't look too closely. But it was forged. Just like the dozens of other contracts Clyde had signed using her stolen authority. Nathan filed preliminary fraud complaints with the state attorney general, sealed and confidential, setting the legal machinery in motion without alerting Clyde that anything was wrong. He contacted the consortium's legal team anonymously, a concerned party, he said, flagging potential signature irregularities that might warrant verification before finalizing an $8.4 billion deal. The consortium took it seriously. They had to. That much money on the line, they couldn't afford not to verify everything. And Nathan prepared what he called the nuclear option. A full evidence package documenting 6 years of systematic forgery. Every forged signature, every fraudulent contract, every piece of proof that Clyde Ashford had built his entire empire on stolen authority. The package was ready to be delivered simultaneously to investors, the press, and law enforcement the moment they gave the word. One button push, and Clyde's world would end. Cordelia asked Nathan the question that had been haunting her since this began. What happens to the company if they do this, if they expose everything? Nathan was honest in a way she appreciated. No sugarcoating, no false promises, chaos, investigations. The SEC would get involved. There would probably be a forced sale or complete restructuring, criminal charges, civil lawsuits, years of legal battles. But also potentially a chance for Cordelia to reclaim what was stolen, to rebuild Evermore Industries the way her father had intended, to turn it back into something that mattered instead of just another corporation chasing billion-dollar deals. Cordelia sat in Nathan's office, looking at the evidence spread across his desk, and thought about her father, about hospitals and affordable housing, about infrastructure projects that served communities instead of just investors. About business that was supposed to help people, not exploit them. She thought about what Richard would want her to do, and she told Nathan to proceed. 2 weeks before the signing ceremony, Clyde threw a pre-celebration dinner at the house. It was exactly the kind of event Cordelia had learned to endure. Investors in expensive suits, executives telling stories about their own successes, board members laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. And Melody, of course, playing hostess like she already owned the place. She'd helped plan the menu. She greeted guests at the door. She made sure everyone had drinks and introduced people to each other with the ease of someone who belonged there. Cordelia was introduced as Clyde's wife, but barely acknowledged beyond that. A footnote. Background decoration. She might as well have been part of the furniture. She sat at one end of the long dining table while Clyde held court at the other end, Melody positioned right next to him where a wife should sit. Halfway through dinner, one of the major investors stood up with his wineglass raised. He made a toast to Clyde's vision and tenacity, to his ability to see opportunities others missed, to his brilliant leadership that had transformed a mid-sized regional company into a global player. Everyone applauded. Glasses clinked. Voices murmured agreement. Then Melody stood up, champagne flute in her perfectly manicured hand, and added her own toast. To the man who built an empire from nothing. From nothing. The words hung in the air like poison. Cordelia felt every eye in the room not looking at her, felt the weight of her own erasure, her father's company, her inheritance. Her signature was forged on every document that made this moment possible, built from nothing. As if Richard Evermore had never existed, as if Cordelia had contributed nothing, as if Clyde had manifested this company out of thin air through sheer force of will. Clyde accepted the praise with false humility. He stood, raised his own glass, talked about hard work and perseverance and seizing opportunities. Then he reached over and squeezed Cordelia's hand, a performative gesture for the guests. "Look at us, the happy couple." His grip was just slightly too tight, a reminder that she belonged to him, that everything here was his, including her. Cordelia smiled through it, raised her glass with everyone else, played her part perfectly. But inside, she was counting down the days until she destroyed him. After dinner, Cordelia excused herself to the kitchen. She needed a moment away from the performance, away from the laughter and the congratulations and the toasts to empires built from nothing. She was standing at the sink, hands braced against the counter, taking deep breaths, when she heard heels clicking on the tile floor behind her. Melody, they were alone for the first time since the gala. Since the wine and the humiliation and Clyde calling Cordelia worthless in front of 300 people. Melody leaned against the kitchen counter, perfectly relaxed, champagne still in her hand. She looked at Cordelia with something that might have been pity if it wasn't so obviously contempt. And then she said something that made it clear she knew exactly how much power she held. Clyde was planning to file for divorce right after the contract was finalized. He'd already had lawyers draw up papers, everything was ready. Cordelia would be bought out with a settlement. Generous by normal standards, Melody said. Enough to live comfortably. But laughable compared to what the company was actually worth. Compared to what Cordelia was entitled to as Richard's heir. Melody smiled that smile that never reached her eyes. She was going to be the next Mrs. Ashford. She'd be standing beside Clyde when he signed the $8.4 billion deal. When he gave interviews to business magazines, when he spoke at economic summits. She'd be the wife who mattered, the wife who belonged in Clyde's world. And Cordelia would be erased completely. Not even a footnote in the story of Clyde Ashford's success. Melody delivered all of this with casual cruelty, like she was doing Cordelia a favor by letting her know in advance. Like she was being kind by giving her time to prepare for her own erasure. Cordelia listened to every word, didn't interrupt, didn't react. When Melody finished, Cordelia thanked her for letting her know. Her voice was so calm, so measured, that it seemed to unsettle the other woman for just a moment. Then Cordelia returned to the dinner party. She sat through dessert and coffee and more toasts. She smiled at the right moments. She nodded when people spoke to her. She played the role of dutiful wife one more time. And when everyone finally left, when the house was quiet and Clyde went upstairs already planning his next triumph, Cordelia called Nathan. "I want to move up the timeline. I want to do it at the signing ceremony." Nathan tried to talk her out of it. He laid out all the risks. Too public. Too many witnesses. Too many things that could go wrong. If they exposed Clyde at the ceremony, it would be brutal and humiliating. There would be no controlling the narrative, no managing the fallout. It would be chaos in front of investors and media and everyone who mattered in Clyde's world. Wasn't it safer to do this quietly? Through legal channels? Without the spectacle? But Cordelia was done being careful, done being quiet. Done letting Clyde control the narrative of her own life. He wanted a legacy moment? She'd give him one. She'd give him exactly what he deserved in front of everyone he'd been trying to impress for 6 years. If he was going to erase her, she was going to erase him first. Publicly. Permanently. Irrevocably. Nathan heard something in her voice that told him arguing was useless. He finally agreed. They had 12 days to finalize everything. The next 12 days were a blur of preparation. Nathan coordinated with the consortium's legal team. They'd independently verified the signature discrepancies by now. They'd brought in their own forensic experts. They'd compared documents, and they were furious, terrified. $8.4 billion on the line, and potential fraud at the foundation of the entire deal. They could be liable, they could be accused of negligence. Their reputations could be destroyed if they signed a fraudulent contract. They agreed to delay the signing by 48 hours. They cited routine due diligence, last-minute verification, standard procedure for deals this size. It bought Nathan the time he needed to get everything in place. Meanwhile, Cordelia played the dutiful wife with an expertise born of 6 years of practice. She helped Clyde choose his tie for the ceremony. Navy blue, or charcoal gray? Which one looked more powerful for the cameras? She listened to him rehearse his speech in front of the bathroom mirror, nodded when he asked if a particular line sounded too arrogant or not confident enough. She even commiserated when he complained about the last-minute delays. So frustrating when you're ready to close the deal and lawyers want to verify one more thing. But that's what you get with international consortiums. Too many people trying to justify their salaries. Clyde had absolutely no idea what was coming. 3 days before the ceremony, Nathan met with Cordelia one final time. They sat in his office and he walked her through exactly what would happen, step by step, moment by moment. Clyde would arrive at the ceremony. There would be presentations, media coverage, build up to the big moment, and then, right when Clyde moved to execute the contract, to put his signature on the document that would make him a billionaire titan, Nathan would present the fraud evidence. Not to Clyde, to the consortium's executives and legal team. He'd show them the forged signatures, the forensic analysis, the proof that Cordelia's authorization had been faked on dozens of contracts, including this one. Simultaneously, the sealed indictments would be opened. The state attorney general would trigger immediate investigation. Law enforcement would be notified. The contract would be frozen instantly. The deal would be dead. And Clyde would be escorted out of his own company's headquarters while everyone watched. Then Cordelia would formally assert her rights as the legitimate majority shareholder of Evermore Industries. It would be brutal, public, irreversible. Every camera in that room would capture Clyde's humiliation. Every investor would witness his fraud. Every media outlet would run the story of how a billionaire built his empire on forgery and lies. Nathan asked one last time if Cordelia was ready, if she understood there was no going back after this moment. Cordelia thought about 6 years of humiliation, about wine dripping down her dress, about being called pathetic and worthless, about her father's company being stolen piece by piece, while she was told she was too inexperienced to understand. She thought about Melody telling her she'd be erased. Not even a footnote. She thought about Clyde squeezing her hand too tight while accepting praise for building an empire from nothing. And she told Nathan she'd been ready for a long time. If you want to see Cordelia finally destroy the man who spent 6 years destroying her, you need to subscribe right now because the signing ceremony is about to become the most devastating takedown you've ever witnessed. And here's my question. If someone stole everything from you and you finally had the chance to expose them publicly, would you take it? Drop a comment because Cordelia was about to make a choice that would change everything. The day arrived. The signing ceremony was held in Evermore Industries' main conference hall. The same building Richard Evermore had opened 30 years ago. The same walls that had witnessed his vision of business serving people instead of exploiting them. Now those walls were about to witness something entirely different. The conference hall was packed. Investors in designer suits, executives with expensive watches, media crews with cameras positioned at every angle. This was the kind of event that made headlines. The kind of moment that defined legacies. This was supposed to be Clyde Ashford's crowning achievement. Cordelia arrived early, before most of the guests. She wore a simple black suit, no jewelry, hair pulled back in a way that was elegant but severe. She looked like she was attending a funeral. In a way, she was. She took a seat in the back row, quiet, unobtrusive, exactly where everyone expected her to be. Clyde arrived 30 minutes later with Melody on his arm, both of them glowing with anticipated triumph. Melody wore white again, of course, a power suit that cost more than most people's cars, her hand possessively on Clyde's arm like she was already his wife. Clyde barely glanced at Cordelia sitting in the back. Why would he? She was irrelevant to this moment, just another guest. Background decoration. He had no idea she was the reason he was here. That every contract he'd signed, every deal he'd closed, every triumph he'd celebrated was built on her stolen authority. He had no idea that in less than an hour, she was going to take it all back. The presentations began exactly on schedule. Financial projections displayed on massive screens. Partnership announcements that made investors nod approvingly. Speeches about innovation and global expansion and the future of infrastructure development. Everything building toward the moment when Clyde would sign the contract that would make him untouchable. $8.4 billion. The deal that would cement his legacy. The deal that would prove he'd transformed a mid-sized regional company into a global powerhouse. The deal that was built entirely on fraud. The consortium CEO approached the table where the documents waited. Leather folder. Expensive pen. Cameras positioned to capture the historic moment. But the CEO looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing toward the door, shifting his weight. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Clyde didn't notice. He was already moving toward the table, already reaching for the pen, already imagining the headlines. Then the doors at the back of the conference hall opened. Nathan entered the room. He was followed by 2 attorneys from the consortium's legal team and a representative from the state attorney general's office. The room went quiet. Not the excited anticipatory quiet of moments before. This was different. Uncomfortable. Wrong. Nathan walked down the center aisle, carrying a folder that looked ordinary, but contained 6 years of evidence. 6 years of proof that would destroy everything Clyde had built. He approached the table where Clyde stood, confusion starting to replace triumph on his face. Nathan addressed the consortium CEO directly. His voice was calm but loud enough for everyone to hear. Before any signatures are placed, there are irregularities in the contract authorization that require immediate review. Clyde's face shifted from confusion to irritation. He tried to dismiss Nathan, tried to assert control, tried to keep the ceremony moving forward. Who was this? Some lawyer, trying to make himself important? This was inappropriate. This was unprofessional. Could someone please escort this person out so they could proceed with the signing? But the consortium CEO cut him off. They'd been made aware of potential fraud, signature irregularities, authorization issues. They needed verification before proceeding with an $8.4 billion contract. The room erupted in murmurs. Investors leaning toward each other, media crews adjusting their cameras. This wasn't part of the script. Nathan opened the folder. He presented the evidence methodically, calmly, like he was teaching a class instead of destroying a man's life. Forged signatures, forensic analysis proving they weren't authentic, timeline discrepancies showing Cordelia was in different cities, different states, sometimes different countries when documents were supposedly signed. Contract after contract after contract, dozens of them, all bearing Cordelia's signature as majority shareholder, all requiring her legal authorization, all forged, including the $8.4 billion deal they were about to sign. Nathan laid out document after document on the table, Cordelia's real signature compared to the forged ones, handwriting analysis, expert testimony, email chains where Clyde referenced her approval on deals she'd never heard of, 6 years of systematic fraud using her ownership stake to build an empire he had no right to build. The room erupted, not in murmurs anymore, in chaos, investors demanding answers. How could this happen? What due diligence was done? Were they all potentially liable? Media cameras capturing everything. This wasn't the story they'd come to cover, but it was infinitely better. A fraud scandal at an $8.4 billion signing ceremony. Clyde trying to talk over everyone, his voice getting louder, more desperate, insisting this was a misunderstanding, a competitor's sabotage. Someone was trying to destroy him. This was ridiculous. This was defamation. He looked at Nathan like he could intimidate him into backing down, like he could assert dominance and make this go away through sheer force of will. But Nathan didn't back down. He just kept presenting evidence. Calm, methodical, irrefutable. Then Cordelia stood. Every eye in the room turned to her. The quiet wife in the back row. The woman everyone had dismissed as irrelevant. She walked down the center aisle toward the front of the room. Her heels clicking on the floor, her back straight, her face calm. She looked nothing like the woman who'd stood with wine dripping down her dress 6 months ago. Nothing like the ghost who'd apologized for taking up space. She looked like Richard Evermore's daughter, like the heir to a legacy that mattered. Cordelia reached the front of the room and turned to face everyone. Investors, executives, media, the consortium CEO, and Clyde, staring at her like he was seeing a stranger. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, not loud, but powerful. The voice of someone who knew exactly what she was saying and exactly what it would cost. She confirmed that she had never authorized these contracts, that her signature had been forged, that her husband had been committing systematic fraud for 6 years, using her ownership stake in Evermore Industries. Every deal, every expansion, every triumph, all built on stolen authority, and now, as the legitimate majority shareholder, she was formally revoking authorization for the $8.4 billion contract and any other agreements signed without her genuine consent. The room exploded. Consortium executives conferring urgently, investors pulling out phones to call lawyers, board members demanding emergency meetings, media crews capturing every second of Clyde's public destruction. Clyde tried to speak, his mouth opened. He reached toward Cordelia like he could physically stop what was happening, but no sound came out. He looked at his wife, the woman he'd spent 6 years erasing, and realized she'd just erased him instead. The contract was frozen. The deal was dead, and Clyde Ashford's empire was collapsing in real time. Security escorted him out of his own company's headquarters, while cameras rolled, while investors demanded their money back. While the consortium's lawyers talked about legal action for fraud and misrepresentation, Melody tried to leave with him, but Clyde pushed her away. Like this was somehow her fault. Like he needed someone to blame. And Cordelia stood at the front of the room, watching the man who'd called her pathetic and worthless get exactly what he deserved. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The consortium withdrew entirely within hours. They threatened legal action for the time and resources wasted, for the due diligence that had somehow missed systematic fraud, for the reputational damage of almost signing a fraudulent contract. Investors panicked. They pulled funding, demanded investigations, called emergency board meetings to figure out how deep the fraud went and how much money they'd lose. The board of directors met without Clyde for the first time in 6 years. They voted unanimously to remove him as CEO pending criminal investigation. They froze his access to company accounts. They seized his company assets. Within 48 hours, Clyde Ashford went from untouchable billionaire to unemployed criminal defendant. His personal assets were frozen while forensic accountants traced every dollar. His properties were seized as potential proceeds of fraud. His bank accounts were scrutinized for evidence of money laundering or embezzlement. And then Melody made her move. Facing potential charges as an accessory to fraud, she did exactly what anyone who knew her should have expected. She turned on Clyde completely. She provided evidence of offshore accounts Clyde had hidden, shell companies in the Cayman Islands, suspicious transfers that even Nathan's forensic accountant hadn't uncovered. She gave prosecutors emails, text messages, recordings of conversations where Clyde discussed hiding assets and covering tracks. She saved herself by burying him. The man who'd built an empire by stealing Cordelia's authority watched everything collapse, while the woman he'd used to secure it all testified against him. While his mistress provided evidence that would add years to his prison sentence, Clyde's lawyers tried to negotiate. They offered settlements. They claimed misunderstandings. They suggested this was a marriage dispute being blown out of proportion by a vindictive wife. But this wasn't a marriage dispute. This was fraud on a massive scale. Forgery, embezzlement, crimes that had cost investors millions and nearly defrauded an international consortium of $8.4 billion. And Cordelia wasn't interested in settlements. She wanted justice. The criminal charges moved forward: forgery, fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, money laundering. The list kept growing as prosecutors uncovered more evidence. Civil suits piled up from investors who'd lost money, from business partners who'd been deceived, from employees whose retirement accounts had been invested in a company built on lies. The media covered every development. Clyde's face was everywhere, but not the way he'd imagined. Not on magazine covers celebrating his success, on news broadcasts documenting his crimes. 3 months after the signing ceremony that never happened, Clyde Ashford was arraigned on 17 criminal counts. Bail was set at $5 million. He couldn't make it. His accounts were frozen, his properties seized, his assets tied up in litigation. The man who'd spent 6 years living like a king couldn't scrape together $5 million. He spent his first night in jail in the same navy blue suit he'd worn to the signing ceremony. The suit he'd asked Cordelia to help him choose because it looked more powerful for the cameras. 6 months later, Cordelia stood in the office that used to be her father's, then Clyde's, and was now hers again. The board had voted unanimously to install her as CEO of Evermore Industries. There had been no debate, no discussion, just recognition that she was the rightful owner and leader of her father's company. The company was smaller than it had been under Clyde's leadership. Contracts dissolved, partnerships unwound, the damage from his fraud considerable. But it was clean now, legitimate, built on real authorization and honest dealings, and more importantly, it was hers. Nathan handled the legal restructuring. They brought back some of Richard's old team. People who remembered when Evermore Industries built hospitals and affordable housing instead of chasing billion-dollar deals. People who believed in business that served communities instead of just enriching executives. Cordelia's first major decision as CEO was to honor the contracts her father would have honored. Affordable housing in underserved neighborhoods. Community infrastructure that actually helped people. Medical facilities that prioritized care over profit. Not as glamorous as $8.4 billion international deals. Not the kind of projects that got you on magazine covers, but solid, honest. The kind of work that didn't require forged signatures or stolen authority. The kind of work Richard Evermore would have been proud of. The divorce was finalized without drama. Cordelia kept the company, the house, and her dignity. Clyde got a prison sentence that was still being negotiated, but would likely keep him locked up for years. Melody had disappeared somewhere in Europe, last anyone heard. Reinvented herself far away from the wreckage. Started over with a new name and a new story that didn't include being an accessory to fraud. Cordelia sometimes thought about that night at the gala. Wine cascading down her emerald dress. 300 witnesses to her humiliation. Clyde's voice calling her pathetic and worthless. She wondered if Clyde thought about it too. Sitting in whatever cell he was waiting in for trial. She wondered if he understood yet that the woman he'd spent 6 years destroying was always stronger than he was. That every time he'd made her smaller, he'd actually been teaching her exactly how power worked and how to take it back. The woman he tried to erase became the one person he couldn't escape. She was in every criminal charge, every civil suit, every news story, every moment of his downfall. Cordelia Evermore, the woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant, had become the center of his entire existence. Cordelia stood at her office window, looking out over the city her father had loved, the city where he'd built hospitals and housing and infrastructure that mattered. She was running the company he'd built, honoring the vision he'd died believing in. Turning Evermore Industries back into something that served people instead of exploiting them. And for the first time in 6 years, she felt like herself again. Not the ghost of a woman who apologized for existing. Not someone's erased footnote. Not the pathetic, worthless wife standing alone at galas while her husband laughed. Just Cordelia. Finally, completely, powerfully herself. And that was worth more than any $8.4 billion contract ever could be. If this story of justice and reclaiming power moved you, subscribe now, because stories like this remind us that the people who try to erase us often underestimate exactly how strong we are.